human beings are. So that was the first attraction to me of the Church of Satan. The next one, in a more social sense, which is the sense that most people, I think, at the time were aware of it, was that the Church of Satan was a statement publicly of anti-hypocrisy. As I mentioned earlier, the mid to late 60s was a time of great popular disillusionment in existing social structures, and the quest was on for something that was honest, that was true, that was pure, that wasn't corrupt, and that you could hold yourself up as a member of and not feel that you were a cheat or a scoundrel or a scam artist. So when I listened to Anton LaVey talk and when I read some of his earlier papers, I thought to myself, here is a person who is very moved like I am in the direction of anti-hypocrisy and ethics and honesty. He doesn't hold himself out to be perfect or pure, but he says, the parts of me that are good, I will take responsibility for. The parts of me that aren't so good, I'll also take responsibility for. And that said, I am in favor of a more ethical and better kind of a person. So I like that ethical stance and that honesty. So the metaphysics and the ethics were what attracted me. In other words, we were dealing here with something honest and that seemed to be very positive, and that also seemed to me to have some kind of an avenue, you might say, into these great universal truths that we were all looking for. And that was the Church of Satan that I knew from 1969 when I joined to 1975. If you were going to become a priest of the Church of Satan in those years, you had to be examined by the senior masters and by Anton, and they had to feel that you were, again, a person of exceptional integrity and that you had an above average familiarity with the metaphysics that we were involved with. And only then could you be entrusted as becoming a priest of Satan, or as we called it, the priest of Mendes. So in 1975, Anton suddenly and unexpectedly announced that he would accept cash contributions to the church as qualification for any higher degree above the first degree in the church. In other words, he put the degrees up for sale. And I went back to him and I said, I don't understand this. You can't do this. I said, this would just turn this into a mockery. And he said, well, I'm going to do it. And basically shut up and cooperate. And I said, well, I'm sorry, as much affection as I have for you, because we were as close as a father and son, and as much regard as I have for the church, I simply can't be a part of something like that, so I'm going to have to say that I'm no longer involved with this. That isn't to say that I resigned my priesthood, because as I saw it, he not only tossed the church out, he tossed the Prince of Darkness out in favor of a personality cult based on himself. And as far as I was concerned, the Church of Satan ceased to exist as a church at that time, and always has, been non-existent since that time. At that point, I conducted an extensive magical working, since known as the North Solstice Working of 1975, in which I had the perception of what then materialized into the Temple of Set. And the original priesthood of the church, who had basically resigned with me at that time, and many of the members of the original church who had also resigned at that time, came together to found the Temple of Set, and then the rest is history. It became a formal religious institution in California at that time, received its state and federal tax-exempt status recognitions, and has continued legitimately ever since.
Now, let me see if I can pull this listener into the show, since I did say this person can ask some questions here. So let me see if I can grab Mr. J. Crapper77 is the moniker. So hang tight, folks, here while we get this taken care of here, so we can actually have a listener into the show here. All right, so let's drag him in and let's see if he's on. Let me try another method here. If not, if you're listening, Jay, out there, feel free to Skype call me and I will pull you into the group, since I know the phone lines are down and I know you guys can only ask questions via chat, or I did leave you my Skype name out there so I could pull you in there until this issue with the phone lines is technically fixed. It's just a matter of time. So I guess I will wait for him. Let me see if I could find him one more time. Jay, I'm looking for you, bud. If you are listening to this, which I see you're in the chat, try to get in, Jay. Let's see here. Yes, he is. Unfortunately, he's calling a group. Okay, Jay, it's not able to bring into that group. You're going to have to call UPRN, United Public Radio, and I'm just going to keep trying to bring you in. So hang up, Jay, until we work this out, and in the meantime, I'm just going to ask Dr. Aquino some more questions. Now, so you mentioned 68 and then 75. At what point, Dr. Aquino, were you able to join the military, and at what rank did you come in? Because I do know when I was at UCSB myself and they wanted to recruit me and they knew I was going off to law school, they told me that if I joined the Marines there between my bachelor's and law school, I would go into basic training and then I would go into OCS. And they said, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in Marines, I would have been captain starting out as a JAG.
Yes, that would be correct. Now, in my case, I suppose if you wanted to chase me all the way back, my first involvement with the U.S. Army was in high school when I joined the junior ROTC of the U.S. Army at Santa Barbara High School. And by my senior year in 1964, I was the cadet colonel in charge of the school battalion. So I had a very positive experience with that. Then I had a nomination to West Point in 1964, and I also had an Army ROTC scholarship offered to me for any other university that I wished to use it at. I took a look at West Point. I decided that it was too cold and there weren't any girls there at that time, so I decided to take the ROTC scholarship at UC Santa Barbara. There is an Army ROTC detachment at UC Santa Barbara, so I, of course, participated in that. And that would be, again, my formal involvement with the Army at that point from 1964 to 1968. In 1968, I was designated as a distinguished military graduate, which is a very rare U.S. Army designation that essentially puts a very few ROTC cadets at the same standing in terms of precedence as West Point graduates. And I was commissioned in the regular Army as opposed to the Army Reserve as a second lieutenant. So I went from the beaches of Santa Barbara to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and thence to jump school and the Special Forces and Psychological Operations schools at Fort Bragg. And then, of course, in 1969, off to Southeast Asia to participate in the Vietnam War out there. So that was my sequence of early involvement there.
Let me ask you this. At what point did you start teaching at the JFK School of Warfare?
Well, I never actually taught there on the faculty. the schools that I went to were ones that were taught there that I graduated from, and those were Special Forces, which is the Green Beret, Psychological Operations, or PSYOP, Civil Affairs, Foreign Area Officer, with a specialty in Western Europe, and finally, of course, the joint designation of all this together, you might say, of Political Military Affairs Officer, which was a sort of a strange personal designation that meant that you were somewhere in between the Defense Department, the CIA, and the State Department, because I also took coursework with the Defense and Central Intelligence Agencies, and then with the State Department's Foreign Service Institute. So I was sort of a political military specialist who would be called in for special jobs or tasks that had to do with the gray area between political and military activities, primarily in Europe, but of course in special operations in Southeast Asia when I was there.
So Southeast Asia clearly at that time was, like you said, the Vietnam War, but it's 1975 at that point. Weren't we out of it, or was there still covert activity going on?
1975 was the year when the North Vietnamese conquered South Vietnam, April 30th, I believe, interestingly enough, while Purgasnacht. And the United States had begun to reduce its forces there around 1969, 1970, but it still had almost 500,000 people there in the military and its various civilian support agencies until then. Nixon began to reduce the forces, essentially gradually removing units and personnel from there. And then about the time that we signed the peace treaty between ourselves and North Vietnam, which I believe was in around 1973, that was pretty much the formal end of the U.S. involvement in the war. The understanding between the South Vietnamese government and Richard Nixon was that if the North Vietnamese broke the treaty and invaded the South, that the United States would come back in. That all went under the table with Watergate because Nixon was out, and the new president, Gerald Ford, made it quite clear, and also Congress made it quite clear, that we weren't going to go back in. We had enough of the Vietnam War at that point. So the North Vietnamese just rolled over South Vietnam, and it became one country in 1975. People sometimes say, well, so we lost the Vietnam War. I said, no, it just took us a while. I said, if you go over to Vietnam today, you'll see Starbucks and Burger King in Hanoi. So I said, on that basis, we probably won. It just took a while for it to show up.
We have at least one of the we have one of the listeners. I've been trying to make sure I can get them in here. I see. I'm trying to get one of the other listeners here, but we do have one question of this person who's been patient. It's at Gerald Hall, and he says, "Can you please ask about the Colonel's involvement in the Phoenix program?"
Whoops. Okay. Well, the Phoenix program, to clarify this a bit, was a number of different programs, and they were introduced by an agency which wasn't supposed to be there at the time. In other words, the Central Intelligence Agency was not supposed to be officially in Vietnam at all. The Central Intelligence Agency, as a matter of fact, is not supposed to be anywhere officially at all, so that if you look for it around the world, you will find various cover names and aliases and all that kind of thing. So what we had in Vietnam in place of the Central Intelligence Agency, for all intents and purposes, was something called CORDS, Civil Operations and Rural Development Support, which was supposed to be a nice civilian outfit that encouraged villages to develop nice governments for themselves and learn how to farm better and so on. The country was divided into 4 geographic combat zones. Combat Zone 1, 2, 3, and 4, going down from the top of the country. The first CTZ up north was occupied by the U.S. Marines, and then the U.S. Army occupied most of the parts of the second, third, and fourth combat zones. We had also, with jurisdiction for the whole country, a U.S. Army Psychological Operations Group, which was the 4th Psychological Operations Group, and it had 4 tactical battalions, of which the 6th PSYOP Battalion had the responsibility for Combat Zone 3. And I was technically assigned to the 6th PSYOP Battalion in CTZ 3. But I was a PSYOP command and control team leader with supervision over the various teams that we had farmed out to units in all over the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone. And those were both U.S. Army units and other civilian ones, and also South Vietnamese ones, and the Australians. So I was involved most of the time with the U.S. Special Forces, the 1st Infantry Division, the 25th Infantry Division out of Cu Chi, the Rough Puffs, or the Regional and Popular Forces, the Irregulars of South Vietnam, the LLDB, which was the South Vietnamese version of Special Forces, and also, interestingly, with CORDS. So I was the CORDS PSYOP officer for all of CTZ3. Now, that meant that any of the psychological operations research and interrogations and intelligence and production of PSYOP materials in 3 Corps Tactical Zone that CORDS requested or that CORDS wanted something developed for had to go through me. So this included things like wanted posters for people who were identified as communist organizers in these various areas of the Viet Cong, or local commanders of the North Vietnamese, or so on. So that would have been my interface with the Phoenix program to that extent. But the U.S. Army's primary involvement with Phoenix was on the intelligence side of things. And therefore, you will find, if you were to go and research this online, you would find a lot of U.S. Army intelligence units that were involved in Phoenix as an intelligence gathering device. But the point I'm getting at here is that neither the PSYOP nor the intelligence side of the U.S. Army was engaged in any assassinations or murders per se. So if you're looking for an explanation of that sinister side of it, then if and when things like that went on, it would have been between the South Vietnamese who were involved with it from their side of it, or possibly, and I say possibly because, again, this would be something that wasn't put down officially anywhere. This would be something you'd have to take up with the Central Intelligence Agency directly, because it would have been their people and the involvement with the South Vietnamese that got into that aspect of it. In other words, if they were identifying bad people and then they dispatched them, so to speak, that was not something that I was involved with or that the U.S. Army intelligence units were involved with. I was simply not there. And indeed, at the time, as peculiar as it sounds, in retrospect, I didn't know that CORDS was CIA. I thought that CORDS was CORDS, and that it was, per its cover, a sort of an aspect of USAID, Agency for International Development, which was how it was advertising itself. The CIA, as I said, never goes under its own name, And when I would meet with these people, none of them ever said, "Oh, by the way, we're CIA."
Yeah, of course. The clowns in America, why would they admit to it, right?
So that's about as clear as I can make it concerning the way CORDS functioned and also the way that the Phoenix program functioned. It was, on its surface, it was a program to identify the Viet Cong infrastructure, and in particular, the people who were terrorizing local villages and forcing them to send their young men out to become Viet Cong. And that's the people that we were, looking for, to the extent that we were looking for people on the intelligence side of it, and the kind of people that PSYOP was also looking for when we would talk with them and produce PSYOP materials saying we'd like to know who are the bad guys who are recruiting other bad guys here. And that's the way it functioned. It was a very multifaceted kind of program. It wasn't like an Al Capone hit squad, per se. It was not a simple operation. It was a complicated one.
Remember that listener I told you wanted to ask questions and I've been struggling to get him in? Well, I can't get him in, but I did get his questions for you, Colonel. So, Colonel, Doctor, both. You literally are both. So first he wants to say that it's an emissary who's asking these questions. So let me make sure I did say I'd pass that along. There's a series of questions, Colonel, so I'm actually going to just go one by one. Okay.
Sure.
How did the Colonel get the name Mickey?
Well, I don't have the name Mickey. That's the easiest one. My name is Michael, and the only nickname I was ever known by, of course, in the Army and occasionally by Anton, was Mike, and that's it.
Okay, this second one I'm going to bypass for personal reasons. I'm going to go to the third one. This is sounds good. Okay, does he know, meaning you, do you know of the black liquid that Max Spears produced before he passed away?
The black liquid that who?
Max Spears produced.
No. I don't even know who Max Spears is, frankly.
It makes two of us, unfortunately. Okay, and this is the last part of the question. He says, what is his take on Pizzagate? Now we're entering the realm of politics.
Yeah. My take on it was, I think I first heard the term somewhere around the time of the 2016 election, and I thought it was pretty silly. Apparently, it was some effort to connect or allege that Hillary Clinton was involved with some kind of a pedophile ring in Washington, D.C., but the whole thing sounded pretty absurd to me, and I didn't pay any more attention than that. I can't imagine. I'm still trying to process the idea of some sinister conspiracy being run out of a pizza parlor, but I guess at this point in my life, nothing surprises me anymore. But anyway, I think that it was just a silly concept in a nutshell.
From what I know, Colonel, it actually extends beyond Hillary. It goes back to Q. I don't know if you've heard about QAnon and all the phenomena going around Q.
No.
Depending upon who you ask, it's either a conspiracy or someone close to Trump who's leaking so-called crumbs of information without violating the laws of national security. And he alleges that there is a lot of pedophilia going on within the government as a way to blackmail them. And it essentially talks about the indictments that are supposed to come down for Hillary rigging the election, which involved Obama, the CIA, FBI, and there's pretty compelling for each of the people. The question is QAnon really a person? Although he has released a couple pictures which seem to be someone that is connected for sure, meaning he has released a picture of Trump on what looks to be a smartphone, possibly his iPhone, in the Oval Office. Another one is a picture on Air Force One reflecting off someone's camera, and the reflection shows the presidential desk on Air Force One, and there's a caption that essentially says, is this a violation of national security because I am taking a picture even though it's a reflection aboard Air Force One? It's a really fascinating thing, but I just wanted to lay the groundwork for you to let you know that that's why Pizzagate, it involves way past Hillary. I think Hillary was just the crux of it.
Okay, well, I never paid, as I said, from my standpoint, I never paid any attention to it besides getting a chuckle out of the name. And when you mentioned the name Q, I immediately thought that, well, there was a villain on Star Trek called Q, and that's all the association that has for me. So I'm not a person who spends an awful lot of time on what I consider to be really absurd or silly conspiracy theories. I'm obviously a sophisticated political scientist, and I know that there are plenty of legitimate conspiracies around. And whether or not something is considered to be a conspiracy or just politics as usual depends upon your personal perspective on it, whether you think it's good or bad. But that's kind of the attitude that I take towards stuff like that.
There also is, this is a question, and first of all, before I ask you, Colonel, let me just tell you what it's about. It's about Douglas Dietrich, so if you want to pass on it, just tell me, otherwise I'll read it.
Go ahead.
Okay, this comes from Pirate Radio Podcasts, and I know he's in South Korea listening right now. I know that for a fact. He says, Douglas Dietrich, among others, have accused Dr. Aquino of some pretty heinous crimes. What's his side of the story?
Okay, the short answer is that Douglas Dietrich is somebody that I heard nothing about until maybe a year or so ago, and then he came out of nowhere and started alleging that he had a past involvement with me, that he'd known me and worked with me in the armed forces, and then he started listing off various accusations and things. And these are, in a nutshell, these are all just made up whole cloth, including his past association with me, which didn't exist, doesn't exist. He's just a bullshit artist from start to finish, period. I can't make it any simpler than that.
He had this animosity, and honestly, it makes no sense of where it came from without having to have met you. And I'm only going by, if my memory serves me best, because it's been quite some time, but I do know when I was on Revolution Radio years ago, and I brought you on for I believe it might have been the second interview, because I did the first one on Dark Matter, the second on that, and he heard about it, he went ballistic, threatening to boycott me, threatening never to come on, which I was fine by that, because when he was on, boy, did he just flip out at the listeners. He couldn't seem to have answered certain things. And Douglas, if you're listening right now, I'm sorry for saying this, but hey, it's the truth. But allegedly, Colonel, he says things essentially that he was, I don't want to say the word super soldier, but there was some black magic, satanic spell that was placed on him, and there was some sacrifice done, and all this sort of fascinating.
Well, I feel very sorry for him if that's the case, but I've never had any involvement with the person in the military or elsewhere. And as I said, he's just a bull thrower who thought he'd try and see if he could drag my name into his personal fantasies to see if he could profit from it somehow, I suppose.
Yeah, and unfortunately, these days, and even 5 years ago, longer than that, using your name, Temple of Set, and anything like that, is going to bring some more books, because especially when there's controversy around Satanism or anything among the left-hand path, and that's what I think. Now, for those people here, here's another interesting one. Okay, Jay Crapper has some more for you, Colonel. So let's go ahead and let's entertain these questions. Does he have any knowledge of some PSYOPs programs relating to UFO or Skinwalker Ranch in Utah?
Whoops. I haven't heard the term Skinwalker Ranch. I mean, the George Lucas, of course, has a place called Skywalker Ranch up north of San Francisco, which is where he, operated a lot of his motion picture projects from. I never heard of Skinwalker before, and PSYOP does not, as a military field or as a government field, we don't have any involvement with UFO, questions or operations or anything one way or the other. The closest that I would come to that was from another part of my career. I was one of the Army's first space intelligence officers in 1990 when they opened up the U.S. Army Space Institute, which is simply, since then, has been absorbed into the U.S. Air Force training programs. But I was one of the first intelligence officers that went through it to become a U.S. Army Space Intelligence officer with the additional skill identifier at that time of 3Y. That's the code name if you were going to be a space person in the Army at that point in time. And I was assigned from 1990 to 1994 as the J2X officer at headquarters U.S. Space Command in Colorado Springs and Cheyenne Mountain. When you have a joint command, which is a command of more than one armed forces, then it's a joint command if it has, like Army or Navy or Air Force components. And then the various staff officers have the designation J in front of them, as opposed to G if it's within the Army. So the assistant chief of staff for the Army in an Army unit would be intelligence would be a G2, but in a joint headquarters would be a J2. And the part of J2 that I was assigned as the officer for was actually Section X, which had to do with, interestingly, open question phenomena that was detected by NORAD at Cheyenne Mountain, because that would all come across my desk as the ex-officer. This was kind of amusing at the time because simultaneously, and I don't know whether they did this intentionally or just accidentally or coincidentally, you had the X-Files going on as a television show.
That's right.
Well, there were real X-Files, and I was the X-officer from 1990 to 1994 at U.S. Space Command. And then there's a subsection of that which actually had to do with questions within the unknown area of phenomena that might or might not have an extraterrestrial life or intelligence aspect to them, and those got a special compartmented designation, which was MJ. And that, of course, I guess was the basis for some people coming up with the urban legend and so on of Majestic 12 and MJ12 and so on. But it was originally a compartmented designation for a kind of a file and a kind of an intelligence study. So I would basically, at that time, be looking at the X-Files and including the ones that had an MJ compartment indication. The compartment designations like that, for example, people will be familiar with the MK ones, which had to do with things like MK Ultra. Well, MJ was just another designation like that in another area.
I want to come back to MK Ultra, and there's quite a few things. I'm going to bypass a question that somebody wrote a while ago because that's going to open up a whole new door. But here's, staying on this topic, Colonel, this comes from Oslo. This is live from South Korea, near Seoul. Also Pirate Radio Podcast. He says, what are his thoughts on Trump's Space Force initiative, plus any related questions regarding secret space program?
I'm sorry, say that again.
What are his thoughts on Trump's Space Force initiative, plus any related questions regarding the secret space program?
Well, I think that probably Trump is a bit of a romantic, and the idea of a space force sounds like fun. He's probably an old Trekkie, in from his kid days, like the rest of us. But I don't think, from what I've seen, and I haven't really looked into it in great detail, but I don't think that he's really thought it through that much as to what a Space Force would be, except maybe purple uniforms or something. But my most recent understanding is that it's sort of settled down into becoming a functional area within the Air Force, which right now has jurisdiction of military involvement with space activities. And they're kind of being careful about it because supposedly the understanding is that space isn't supposed to be militarized. And if you start agitating to create military forces up there, the next thing you know, then everybody else has them, and then you've got a dangerous situation.
Right?
Yeah. So I think that, the effort until now was to try to keep that civilianized in something like NASA, and hope that it wouldn't be too militarized. But of course, ever since the days of the space shuttles, we've had military applications going on up there. And of course, the 500-pound canary is that the world's communication systems are all through orbital satellites. So if you start attacking communication satellites, the whole world is going to go blind. So it's a very, very freaky and very nervous area, and I think that trying to soften the U.S. approach to it back into a civilian area is a wise step to go in that direction, as opposed to trying to create a bunch of space cadets.
There are, real quick before I jump to more of these questions, this is something interesting, and I couldn't confirm this before he passed away, the sixth man on the moon, Edgar Mitchell, was not able to confirm this. Neither was Story Musgrave, but the buzz, I'm putting that in quotations, Colonel, is that each civilian flight into space contained at least one military astronaut. Is this conspiracy, or have you heard anything about that?
No, I don't dispute that. I don't have any statistics on it, but obviously the military all had an involvement in the astronaut program, so it wouldn't be unusual for one or more of them to have a military background. I would expect that probably most of them would. But somebody also, I think, I forgot to give you an answer on that business about the secret space program question. That's a kind of a new buzzword, in the internet underground, I guess, for how much money is off the books and is being used to I don't know, create secret bases on the moon or something like that. And there's obviously a big black budget that goes into all kinds of secret stuff that is off the books that nobody wants anybody else to know about. But from my exposure within the U.S. Space Command, this was all fairly under what you would call a normal research and development area of technology, as opposed to some giant conspiracy to create some kind of an off-world empire or something like that. So I tend to be on the common sense side of that kind of a question and say, yes, a lot of black money has been spent on space development and research, but not in some kind of a malevolent or conspiratorial sense.
Gotcha. Okay, now let's go on, because these questions are piling up, Colonel, so I hope this is totally okay with you. These people are fans
go ahead,
here.
Sure.
Let's go back. Okay, so we got Pirate Radio Podcast's question. Now back to Jay Crepper. Says, can you ask the Colonel about a Tyrian purple classification badge?
Whoops, a what?
Tyrian, Tyrian. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it.
A classification badge called Tyrian?
Tyrian purple, yeah.
Manchurian purple. No. Normally, when you get to, here's the way the classifications work. You've got three basic security clearance classifications, which are confidential, secret, and top secret. And then at the top secret level, you get compartments added onto it, so that if you have a top secret clearance, then you might also be cleared for Q compartment, which has to do with nuclear weapons, or you might be cleared for the air defense space satellite kind of thing, which would be TK, or talent keyhole, or, as I mentioned previously, something like the MJ or MK. So if you had a person who had a clearance above top secret, it would be a top secret clearance with a normally a 1 or 2 letter compartment added onto it, or a series of them, if the person had access to more than one compartment. But they tended not to have big long names, obviously. If you walked onto an installation, you would get a badge when you went on the installation that you would hang on your jacket, that would be in the appropriate color and would have the designations and the letters on it and your photograph and all that kind of thing. But if you hear something like a very long name like that, it doesn't sound like a government security clearance designation or compartment.
Let me continue on with these, because I have a feeling they might literally take us to the probably end of the show. So this is also literally from Jay. Says, can you please describe some projects that went on at the farm? And this is just my personal thing, is I think when he refers to farm, I'm thinking the CIA's training facility.
Well, sure. I mean, what actually goes on at the farm is classified information, and I couldn't discuss that in detail. But it's simply the CIA's training area for people who want to be lifelong CIA officers. And so they go there and they learn how to do intelligence, and they learn how to do interrogations, and they learn how to operate in foreign countries and hopefully not get caught or make fools of themselves. And it's the training area really for CIA agents that way.
Okay, more. We have, now I'm going to go a little bit out of order here. Let's see what this is. Now, Gerald Hall asks, I just wanted to know more about his relationships with NATO. What are these chiefs really like? And then he goes on to say, I read they all went to Wewelsburg, Wewelsburg Castle with
Ravensburg.
There you go, with the colonel. Was that a team-building exercise?
No, NATO didn't. NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, which is the loose political and military alliance of the Western nations and the United States in Europe, formed after World War II to sort of oppose the Warsaw Pact of the Soviet Union, is a political and a military cooperative institution. And then the military part of NATO, or SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Forces Europe, at this time I was involved with it was based out of Brussels, and I presume it still is. But it was, as I said, a military alliance loosely formed to counter the Soviet Warsaw Pact, which was the similar alliance of the Soviet Union and its satellites in the East. When the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact all collapsed around the end of the 80s, NATO found itself without anything to do. And there was some discussion at the time about closing it down. Well, no bureaucracy likes to be shut down, so NATO desperately looked around and found something else to do with itself, and that's why you see supposedly NATO being the presence that we have in places like Afghanistan, which would have really perplexed the original NATO people, because it doesn't seem to have much to do with what it was put together for. In any case, I told you earlier that I was qualified as a foreign area officer for Western Europe by the Army, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the State and Central Intelligence Agency. And my primary headquarters assignment was to NATO headquarters of SHAEF over into Europe as a political military affairs officer, primary code 48G or 48 Golf. So that was my prime designation in my career. So I spent a lot of time running around Europe, getting involved in various military exercises that were going on, trying to mediate with German farmers who were pissed off that some American or British tank had just run through their barns in the middle of some exercise, visiting the wall area, talk about walls, you know, the wall between East Germany and West Germany and so on, that was overseen by the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment at that time, and similar Cold War things. The Wewelsburg, on the other hand, has nothing to do with NATO per se. That's an old castle in Westphalia, which is a state of West Germany, which was selected by Heinrich Himmler to be the spiritual center, you might say, of the SS. And over the course of Nazi Germany, and particularly the pre-war era, he spent a lot of time refurbishing it and redesigning it to become the sort of ceremonial and spiritual headquarters of the SS. I had heard bits and pieces of this over the years, and finally, I think around 1982, 83, I decided to chase it down and visit it, and I did, and actually conducted an extensive magical working there, since known as the Wewelsburg working, and that became the basis for the extremely sophisticated Order of the Trapezoid within the Temple of Set. It was founded on the basis of that working. And also, I suppose, became sort of jump-started a lot of other occult people's interest in the castle. So now the castle's museum people tell me with a kind of a woeful expression that they have a parade of all kinds of occultists who come to the place and want to hold activities there and so on, who are just sort of routinely, they politely say, well, no, you know. So that's the history of the Wewelsburg in a nutshell. If your listeners want to learn a lot about the sort of the inside and background story of the Wewelsburg, you might take a look at one of my books called We Break the Sword, which is an alternate history of World War II, in which there's a lot of time spent with subjects like the Wewelsburg, taken from the original records of the castle and from my involvement with the Christ Museum Wewelsburg, which is the government's official museum located there.
There are quite a few questions, and I'm going to go back and forth through them, sort of try to stay in point, even though they're literally covering a lot of different areas. And I know you can handle them because you're one of those people that literally will take whatever people are asking and set the record straight. Jay here wanted to convey to you that he is a big fan of your work, and he wanted to thank you. That's one thing he wanted me to.
Well, thank you, Jay. I'm glad I've been able to be helpful.
Now he says, can you please talk about Lamb, the entity Lamb, when you get a free moment? I guess that would be now. Lamb. I'm assuming that has to do with Aleister Crowley's creature, or whatever you want to call it, that dictated the Book of the Law.
Yeah, I was trying to pull that out of the recesses of my head. And yes, I think that was one of the spirits or inspirational critters that Aleister Crowley interacted with, but I have no information beyond that, and it was not, as far as I know, it was not one of his principal interests. His chief holy guardian angel was Aiwass, Aiwass, who was the medium, you might say, who guided him through his Book of the Law experience, and that would be his, I suppose, his primary spirit guide if you wanted to look at that. I think that Lamb, I'm very vague on this, but I think, as I said, that it was a sort of a minor character in one of his ritual workings, but that's about all I know about it.
Now we're going to go to Chief Wiggums. He's got quite a few questions here. And again, these are controversial questions, but I'll ask them. Okay. Ask him about the role of pedophilia and child sacrifice in Babylonian mysticism.
I have no idea. I really don't have an interest in pedophilia or child sacrifice, either historically or in any other way. So I've never bothered to look into it. I know that a lot of the old paganisms, and for that matter, the roots of things like Judaism, involved human sacrifice. But as I said, I haven't really I don't have any kind of a fascination with topics like that, so I don't spend any more time with them than I have to.
Chief Wiggums also ask him about Satanism and the global elites.
Well, let me approach that from this angle. Like many people, I went and saw the movie Eyes Wide Shut by Stanley Kubrick. And in the middle of it, Tom Cruise winds up at what is supposedly an Illuminati party of power elite people who are involved in sex activities for the evening. And when Tom Cruise is discovered, he's threatened and kicked out. And I suppose that people have an image of there being an international cabal of leaders and elites who are also Satanists or Satan worshipers. And I simply have not found that to be the case at all. As a matter of fact, I remember chuckling at the movie because I was saying to myself, if real elites got together for a party and all they could think of to do at the party was to stand around mute watching a few of them have demonstration sex with a few prostitutes, that's kind of a silly way to spend the evening. Since they were all masked, they couldn't even enjoy a good banquet together. And it's been my observation that this sounds good, and this sounds good as a sort of a teaser. These secret satanic rituals among elites and stuff. I do think that there is some evidence that I think it's the Rothschilds used to have some rather bizarre dress-up parties where people would go in masks and for exotic evenings at the Rothschild estate and so on. But I don't think it was anything more than just a few bored people trying to do something like that for themselves. The elites of the world, I think, if you zero in on it, would probably be plutocrats, financial elites that are looking at the world as a business opportunity or as a business threat, as it were. And they're not going to spend a whole lot of time on any kind of religious or occult ceremonies because that gets in the way of money. Nor are they metaphysically inclined. They're not doing this for the devil. They're making money for themselves, and that's that. So that would be my honest take on that. Not that I don't enjoy a good conspiracy movie or something, but this has been a pretty silly area, I think.
This is also from Chief Wiggums. Ask Kim how trauma-based mind control creates Manchurian candidates.
Well, again, the short answer is that it doesn't. And I'll go into that a little bit here because it actually has to do with an area that I did spend some time with and wrote a book about called Mind Wars, or Mind War rather. And let me put it this way: back in the 1950s and 60s, the Central Intelligence Agency had a series of programs going. Of course, the most infamous one being MK Ultra, in which they were trying to see if they could create robot assassins with no memory. So we can program somebody to go kill somebody and have no knowledge of it, sort of like a Sirhan kind of thing, I suppose. And it was almost completely a failure, even before it got exposed, and it was a failure for what would have been very obvious reasons if anybody with any brains had been looking at it from the outside. The program was formally exposed and shut down, I think, while I was still in high school, but if a short time after that, when I had finished my education and so on, if anybody had asked me about it, I would have said, you're wasting your time and the taxpayers' money on this, because that isn't how the human brain operates. And I went into this in extreme detail in my book, Mind War. So if you want to see what is under the heading of, the technical term is brain architecture or thought architecture. And this is how human thought actually functions. Your listeners may be aware that when you look at human thought, about 5% of it takes place at the conscious level, and the other 95% of it takes place at the subconscious level. At the conscious level, this is called algorithmic thinking, which means the reasoning process that we go through when we are trying to figure out how to heat up a cup of coffee in the microwave. At the subconscious level, this means pattern thinking, which means that your sense of reality, your perception of reality around you, has solidified into a number of interlocking patterns of what's real and what's not, and what's reliable and what's not. And then you behave and you think and you perceive reality according to the patterns that are in your brain. An example might be that you don't bother to think when you get to a stoplight that you should go or stop, because the pattern that has to do with that means that red means stop, yellow means slow, and green means go. So you don't have to figure this out every time you get to a street intersection. So pattern memory is not just subconscious, which means that you aren't necessarily aware of it or how it gets there. It just gets absorbed into you, you might say, by a number of forces, which can be both intentional and unintentional. And the algorithmic part of it is what you would actually learn if you are looking at things like philosophy classes, or just the instruction of how to get through life, or going through a technical school to become a lawyer or something like that. So the part of your brain that holds the memories is very short and very transitory in the algorithmic area, unless you use it a lot. So if you took German in college, for example, but then you don't use it a lot and sort of lock it into a pattern, you're going to lose it very quickly, because algorithmic memory is very short and very transitory. This is why people like hypnotists can hypnotize somebody at the algorithmic level for a very brief time, but can't carry it over into some kind of a long-range program, such as your person is talking about in terms of a Manchurian candidate kind of scenario. The things that make up pattern thinking are very general and not specific. So in the Mind War book, I go into a number of these which we can influence, because they all have to do one way or the other with the electromagnetic spectrum. The human body is an electromagnetic and chemical machine. Your brain is a part of that machine. Once you know the parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that are acting upon it, and you can adjust them, and you find out what creates positive and negative attitudes, you can control these, and you can change generalized human dispositions and attitudes. But you can't program a bunch of chess moves into it, because that's, again, not the way pattern thinking works. You can influence the patterns, and you can adjust those to make somebody nice or not nice, for example, but you physically can't put a bunch of commands into a person that can be acted upon later. The closest area that the MK Ultra people got to this was their work with hypnotism, but even that still came up at the short-range memory basis. And using chemicals such as LSD or DMT or anything else to try to influence the brain is absurd, because all it does is scramble the thought processes, whether they're patterns or algorithmic. So you just put a bunch of garbage up there and make people hysterical and unreliable, and you accomplish nothing. So if somebody'd asked me back then, well, what about MK Ultra? I'd have said, you're wasting your time, you're wasting the taxpayers' money, you're trying to use algorithmic influences on a person to create a pattern reliable kind of control robot, and this is apples and oranges. It doesn't work that way. That's not the way the brain functions, and you're kidding yourselves. When I wrote this book, Mind War, I was looking at the huge amount of random violence that is occurring on the international level, and saying to myself, there's got to be a reason for all this and for all the hatred and the bloodthirstiness that's going on around the planet. And I wonder if there are patterns here that are out of control, that are randomized to the point of being destructive, and whether we could kind of find out what they are and replace bad influences with good ones. If you have an area, for example, that's saturated with a lot of scrambled beta wavelength thought waves or brain waves, if you were to replace that with alpha, you'd calm down people and make them more pleasant and intelligent without knowing why. Because this is an attitude change at the pattern subconscious level. So programs like MK Ultra were doomed from the start, and the CIA should have, excuse my French, but it should have fucking known better right out of the gate that this was a stupid concept and a stupid thing to do. The research that I explain very carefully in the book Mind War makes this quite clear, and it's not rocket science.
Now, this would be a question that could be not just applied to you, Colonel, but also other veterans. And let me get to the exact question, because more and more are piling up, my friend. You got lots of them here. Okay. Can you ask the Colonel what the most messed up thing he heard about in Vietnam during the war?
Oh, wow. The most messed up thing. Geez. Well, as a sort of a prologue to that, I'll say that when I saw the movie Apocalypse Now, I said, yep, been there, done that, got the T-shirt to just about everything that went on in the movie. Even the premise of the movie, that there was a Green Beret colonel who had conducted some unauthorized assassinations and was being attacked for it by the system, was based on the very real case of Colonel Robert Rialt, who was the commander of all special forces in Vietnam at about, I think it was around 1970. And he had authorized some assassinations of double agents that got him in trouble, and specifically got him in trouble with the overall commander of American forces in Vietnam, 4-star General Creighton Abrams. Abrams ordered Rialt and several members of his staff to be court-martialed, and they were arrested and imprisoned for a while at Long Bin Army Base there in Vietnam. And then Rialt said, well, if you court-martial me, then I want my attorneys to subpoena a lot of the CIA people that were involved with this. And that was a no-no. As I said, the CIA was not supposed to be in Vietnam, so they couldn't very well be subpoenaed. And the long and short of it was that they had to drop the court-martial charges against Rialt and all of his people on that basis, because the minute he wanted to bring the CIA into it, then that crossed the line. So, in case your listeners are curious, was there ever anything like the scenario with Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now? Yes, there was, and the real guy was Colonel Robert Rialt, and he retired honorably since he couldn't be court-martialed for that, but that was the basis of that. The war in Vietnam, look, in 1954, which kind of goes back to, the end of the French era over there, there was an agreement that they were going to hold elections between the temporary governments of the North and the South to see if the people of Vietnam wanted to unify as one country. It became very obvious that the person who was going to win that election was Ho Chi Minh, who was the George Washington of Vietnam. He might have been a nominal communist, but he was basically a patriot of Vietnam, and he was perfectly happy to quote Thomas Jefferson as much as he was going to quote people like Lenin. So the United States refused to participate in a unifying election and sort of solidified things and set up the puppet government in the South under President Diem. And that started the situation where Ho Chi Minh and the people from the North wanted to reunify the country, including the South, and the people in the South wanted to keep their own regime going. So you've got a very awkward and undemocratic, you might say, situation from the ground up there, and anything in the Vietnam War that proceeded on that basis, that we were trying to prop up an artificial government, and the one in the North was also a client state in which both Russia and China were trying to fight for influence and control over it. Ho Chi Minh didn't want to be run by either Moscow or Peking, but he was perfectly happy to accept aid from both of them. And it kind of goes downhill from there. I mean, I could go on and on and on.
I know you can, and that's the fascinating part. But the questions keep piling up. Before we get to the next question, there is actually, someone made a good point, and I figured you could elaborate on this one comment. Let me pull up this comment and make sure I'd read it properly, because I thought it's something that you definitely would want to touch on. Oh, this is from Adaraki Studios, also known as Adam. He is a moderator and a great friend of mine. He says, satanic worship is very misconstrued in the MSM. I figured you can touch on that because it really is.
Well, yes. As a matter of fact, I'll pat myself on the head and just say I just wrote a Bible. The Satanic Bible 50th Anniversary Revision, which is currently in print on Amazon, several editions. So anybody who is curious about what I would consider to be the real, authentic, and intellectually honest and adult concept of the satanic religion, I would say go get that book, and it's all in there. In a nutshell, when you look at any kind of a satanic concept, or Setian for that matter, in the Egyptian way of looking at it, you are looking at an independent consciousness that is distinct from and sees itself in contrast to the rest of the universe. or as I call it, the objective universe, or OU. So if you look at the totality of natural law, as somebody like Thomas Aquinas would have said, or as Aristotle would have said, the totality of natural law is how everything around you exists and functions, and all the physical stuff that you see around you, and the way that energy and matter interact and so on. That's all natural law. But you are a point of perspective that is distinct from it, because you have a consciousness, and you're a unique, isolate consciousness that's looking at all this, and it has the ability to distinguish itself from it and to use it and to maybe tinker with it and maybe even try to violate it. And that sense of uniqueness and difference is the Setian or satanic impulse in you that makes that gives a reality to a personification like Satan or Set. So you are looking at the intelligence that is distinct from God or the gods, which is another word for the totality of natural law. Now, this distinct thing it's, as I said, it's distinct, but it's not necessarily good or bad. It's just independent. So if you look for the common thread in Satanism of any sort, and you get away from the comic book stuff, this is it. You're looking for something that is beyond simple moralities, or beyond good and evil, or beyond controlled things. You're a unique actor, responsible to yourself for good or bad, and that's the satanic impulse. So if you look at the Satanic Bible that I just wrote or updated, you will find that it seeks to understand and to help to define and identify what it means to be an independent actor in the universe, and what you can do once you understand this about yourself. And then, of course, some arguments and propositions as to what you should do. In other words, are you just supposed to have a wild time and be a hedonist? Or a more sophisticated kind of person, be an Epicurean? Or are you supposed to follow the example of somebody like Plato and look for higher meanings and for a perfection in your own behavior and the behavior of other independent people like you? So those are the big questions that have to do with Satanism and the satanic religion. You can see here that when I look at a movie like Eyes Wide Shut and I see that there is a bunch of Satanists and all they can think of to do is have a sex party, I say to myself, well, that's pretty stupid. If these were real Satanists, they wouldn't be, wasting their time on something as OU and animalistic as just having a fuck party. They would be trying to discuss among themselves the realities of the universe and how they could change it or use it. So that's what my Satanic Bible goes into in extreme depth, but I've tried to keep it in language that people can understand if they are coming to this from a background which is not a graduate student in philosophy or something like that. It is in plain English and in a context that I think people can relate to when they're looking at themselves and at their own lives and at who they are. It's the old philosophical adjuration that says, know thyself. Well, this is what you're being asked to do, to figure out exactly who you are, why you're behaving as you do, and are you pleased with the way you're behaving. And I quote, or rather Satan does in his foreword to this, the famous line that says that we shall not cease from exploration, and the end to all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So it's a book of self-exploration.
And like you said, you did write it for people to understand it. I'm assuming especially people that are not familiar with the left-hand path, to sort of give them an idea.
Yes. I'm a great foe of woolly language and buzzwords that mean nothing because somebody's trying to be impressive with a bunch of garbled terms that mean nothing. I hate that kind of thing. If you've got something useful to say, then say it straightforwardly, so that people can understand you, and then if they want to, they can pick your brains apart, and that's good. But just using a bunch of technical, vague terms that mean nothing doesn't help anybody.
Agreed. Does Dr. Aquino know of any programs ran during the 80s and 90s in schools in America to recruit high-level talents?
No, I'm not sure. Talents for what? I mean, I'm not really sure about that kind of a question, because I don't know what they're talking about, really.
I agreed, and maybe the listener Jay here will correct and maybe add more to that, I guess is the best way. Dr. Aquino, I'm going to try to get as much as we can in 13 minutes before we have to be off air. So here's another one. What is Dr. Aquino's take on the coming artificial intelligence revolution?
Woo!
Yeah.
Okay. This goes, kind of back into the areas that I'm involved with in the book Mind War. So people who really want to get into this, I would, again, suggest that you think of picking up a copy of that book and looking through it, because this all has to do with what, and for that matter, the Satanic Bible, that it has to do with what you are as an individual, as an intelligence, because if you are going to try to come down on the question of whether computers are alive and intelligent, then if there is a distinction to be made, it's that machines like that can process information. They can manipulate the information from that objective universe, but they do not go beyond it. They are not creative beyond the known, the factors of the known. Friedrich Nietzsche, had a term which he used. It was called horizon building. And by that he meant that human beings have the ability to go beyond merely recombining known information to creating new concepts. If you look, for example, at the writings of H.P. Lovecraft as a good example, there was a very brilliant man who stretched the limits of language to go beyond simple routine horror stories into concepts that went beyond sort of the known capacities of the known universe. And he got these very bizarre, very strange, monsters and scenarios and concepts together. And he did a pretty good job of explaining these things in English to his readers. Of course, many people read him as a horror author, but as an intellectual, I would suggest you take a look at stories like The Silver Key and Hypnos, Hypnos, to see how he deals with the metaphysical and the power of the independent human mind to create beyond the objective universe. So I would say that the capacity of humanity, which has always fascinated me, which is that satanic and Setian capacity, is that not just that you are an independent consciousness, but that you are a creative independent consciousness that actually has the ability to create universes, or subjective universes, as I refer to them in these texts. In one of my books called Mind Star, I go into the whole notion of the human soul and look at it from that standpoint, because the Egyptians actually had a very sophisticated understanding of what the soul is. They actually subdivided it into several key areas, which are discussed at length in the book, which would take us well beyond that 15 minutes.
Yes.
But the point is that here's the crux of the matter. Artificial intelligence is a big adding machine, a big multiplying machine, a number cruncher. You as an individual, even when you're at your most humble, you go beyond that. You have the power to create new universes and things that did not exist and that are not simply recombinations of existing natural law phenomena. That's the big difference, and that's why computers, no matter how fancy and how fast they get, will always be good adding machines, but they will never replace this unique thing in each one of you, which we call, the Setian intelligence, or the satanic intelligence in you.
This is under 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to briefly ask you more about this AI. The reason I think this person was asking about artificial intelligence is there's been a couple people on this show that said that recent testings of artificial intelligence have shown a few complications. For instance, one, it seemed that the artificial intelligence seemed to be hiding information from us, from the creators. And even one thing further, and two people have said the same thing, two guests, one being Jack Ashcraft, the other being David Adair, said that during the testing of the AI, not only were they hiding things, it seemed that the AI wanted to get rid of the creators. And the first thing that pops in my head is Terminator 2 style. Skynet's Skynet's had self-realization, and then you have these machines wiping off Earth. I think that's sort of what it was getting to. What's your take on that? I know you just mentioned the fact that they don't have a soul. They never will have this type of intelligence. Do you think it's ever possible for AI to become, or to realize that it is in fact intelligence and it can make decisions without us?
Well, of course you can have a program that can run automatically, but it's still limited to the reprocessing of OU information. It's a big adding machine. That's all it is. And it can take, mathematics and formulas and things like this, and it can recombine them and plug them in. It can beat you at a chess game, easily for reasons like that. But it can't create from something that isn't there in the existing amount of information that it has, and that is the observed, natural law universe, the objective universe. You can, as an individual, you can go beyond this, and that's why it isn't so much that a sophisticated AI program can be hiding something from you. It's that you may very quickly lose the ability to understand what it's doing, because it's processing information at a much faster and more complex level than you can understand, because your brain doesn't pay attention to stuff like that. It's a big number crunching thing. I mean, that's the simple thing. It's not a conspiracy on the part of a machine intelligence or a robot. It's simply that it's doing things at a level of complexity that you can't easily follow. And it's for the same reason that no matter how intelligent, how sophisticated, you make an AI program, or an AI program makes itself because they can improve themselves, they can never go beyond that OU limitation. And there's probably one of the more interesting books there. Take a look at the works of Isaac Asimov.
Yes.
And his robot series, because he goes into, in I, Robot and others, the evolution of robotic intelligence from the simple to the very complex. And again, he comes down with this thing, and indeed, from this machine standpoint, there's a point at which machines will start to look at human beings as being imperfect or diseased because they do step outside of natural law. And we do it very casually and unconsciously and all the time. Jack Williamson, I think, in his novel The Humanoids, posits a group of a civilization of highly intelligent robots that takes over humanity and basically dumbs us down to the level of happy idiots, so that we don't hurt ourselves. And that's what Isaac Asimov's robots also wind up doing, is trying to protect people from themselves, you might say, through the notion that by stepping outside of natural law that we'll just get ourselves in trouble. But that's the difference, whether you can step outside of natural law or whether you can't. Humans can, machines can't.
We have just a couple of minutes, so I'm going to try to squeeze these two in, and I hope we have enough time, literally. Think just as quickly as possible. This is sort of
Sure.
piggybacking on the last question. Will quantum computing breach the unknown?
There's two buzzwords in there, quantum and unknown. I don't like words like quantum because they tend to be used to excuse sloppy thinking. And a lot of quantum physics and quantum mechanics, to my way of, as I've looked at it, is just sloppy thinking and a way of trying to get around what's the reality of the universe. It's the same reason I take issue with a lot of sloppy use of words like dimensions and planes and things like this. That's sloppy, stupid thinking and sloppy, stupid argument because it doesn't explain anything. And the unknown is, of course, an open field. There's the unknown objective universe, which is all the stuff in natural law that we are still trying to find out, and that's where machines, of course, they can go there, and very skillfully. But there's also the uncreated and the possibly uncreated, and that's, of course, what we as individual isolate intelligence can create, and that's limitless.
This question, I really don't know how we're going to be able to answer it in such a short time unless you just want to reference where this probably should have been asked early on. I Can Build It says, where does consciousness come from? I mean, okay, Aquino, it's on you.
Okay, the simple and fast answer to that is go get my book called Mind Star. That's the one that addresses the mystery, if you want to look at it that way, of the human soul.
Final question I'm going to take for you. And by all means, we're going to have time to plug in every book real quick. This is the final things. I'm just going to read all three in one.
Go ahead.
Did he make psychic warriors? Maybe ones that he didn't know would pop up, and maybe psychic warriors for truth that didn't know.
No, I don't make psychic warriors. I would never use a term like that. I don't even know what it would mean, because psychic tends to be another kind of buzzword. I educate intelligent people as best I can, but I don't do anything with that is deceptive. So when you read my books, I'm talking to you the way I'm talking right now on the phone. I want us both to understand what we're talking about, and so that nobody's bullshitting anybody else on this stuff.
Well said. Unfortunately, because we literally are so close to the time, the other people who have questions and comments, thanks, folks, for asking them, and I know for sure the Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Aquino appreciates them all, but we just simply didn't have enough time. Dr. Aquino, it is always a pleasure to speak to you on air, off air, and I'm very privileged to call you my friend. Real quick, you mentioned the Satanic Bible. I know about Mind War, Mind Star. Let's plug in all your books right now and where people can find them. And do you have any website, anything like that people can search more about you? And one question was where can they join the temple? I said I figured that could sort of be brought into this end too.
Okay, the easiest way to find all my books in one place is to go to Amazon.com and search for the author, Michael A. Aquino, Aquino, and you'll see all my books. There are about 16 or 17 of them there, and they're all listed. They're all in print. They're all available. So help yourself, and if you go to their individual pages, they're pretty well described. Most of them have reviews, and you can use the look inside feature to take a look inside at their tables of contents and so on. So I would suggest that that's the easiest way to look at that. And if you have questions that came up during this interview, I've tried in my books to kind of crisscross and share everything that I've learned in my time here on this planet, to share it with everybody. So the answer is probably in there someplace. And then the other thing is, if you're interested in the Temple of Set, the Temple of Set differs from the Church of Satan because the Church of Satan was, when it existed, was intended to be a religion for the public, for those who were interested in the subject. The Temple of Set is an initiatory school, so it is selective and exclusive. That's an entirely different kind of an approach. But if you go to the Temple of Set website, you'll find out about all that the easiest way from there.
Now it's time for me to throw in some thank yous. First of all, I want to thank station owner of 107.7 FM in New Orleans, Louisiana, which is United Public Radio Network, Joe Montaldo. We also have to thank JC of Deprogrammed Radio in the United Kingdom for also carrying the show, plus all the affiliates. iHeartMedia. Must thank them for carrying this show on mainstream networks, which is kind of ironic because we're talking about things that I would think iHeartMedia would sort of push us away. I also want to thank Adam, who also goes by Adaraki Studios, for being my moderator. We also have Josh Teres, who is my assistant producer and VP of operations. And Pam Vrettenberg. Make sure you check out her website, UnitedTruthSeekers.com. If you guys and gals listening have any guest requests, don't hesitate to email Josh at Dr. J Radio Live Guests, plural, at gmail.com. That is Dr. J Radio Live Guests at gmail.com. The most important people I need to thank are you folks, the listeners. This show is all about you. That's why I said if you have any guest requests, by all means bring them. This is why when I have my own questions, I push them aside and make sure yours are forefront, because this show is all about you. Depends. It doesn't matter if we're talking about UFOs or politics, or in this case, all these great stuff that we've talked with this very intelligent Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Aquino, who is super intelligent, as many of you have also noted in the chat room. Remember, folks, take everything that you hear, and instead of being passive listeners, become proactive. Do something with it. When it comes to UFOs, many of you guys are talking about disclosure and such. Well, listen, folks, it requires participation, and that's why I always say it's up to you folks, and that's also why I say I do this all for you. Now remember, the only thing you need to remember when it comes to this show is the name of it. That's Dr. J Radio Live, DRJ Radio Live. The website, drjradiolive.com. Clearly you on YouTube know it's at DRJ Radio Live, and that is the same username for everything. Minds.com, that is a cryptocurrency Facebook type of site that pays you an Ethereum-based token just for using it. And BitTube, which is also the cryptocurrency equivalent of YouTube. Although if you notice, YouTube is our primary way that we follow the chat, and I do pay attention to that. And every other social media account that you could think of, from Facebook, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, Instagram, you name it, it's all at DRJ Radio Live. Now, I hope you folks had a chance to check out this last Saturday video, which was not a guest interview per se, but it was some cool little journalism that I have to say was done by Third Phase of Moon, and therefore there's a commentary, and it's got some really amazing footage. You're going to start to see more of that on days where there are no guests. Also, I want to thank all the folks in YouTube Nation and every single listener who's been listening around the world. And with that being said, folks, now in the City of Angels or City of Demons, also in Northern California and in Louisiana and London, I want to say we are officially signing off.